An intelligent Jewish girl, hungry for education and hungry for life, in a loveless family, in a closed society with very rigid and stifling rules, an arranged marriage that does not lead to freedom and self-determination, but only from one environment of male domination to the next one. This is the world that is presented to us by this fascinating novel, Deborah, written by the Yiddish author Esther Kreitman Singer. Welcome to this new episode of Yiddish literature, in which I would like to introduce you to the writer Esther Kreitman Singer and her first novel, Deborah. This is a touching and sometimes also heartbreaking novel about an intelligent young Jewish woman who suffers from the restrictions and from the neglect and contempt of her family and society due to ideological and social constraints of this strictly orthodox family and society. And a girl who tries with all her might to liberate herself from these restrictions. It's an instructive and very moving, touching coming of age novel about the attempt at liberation, which provides us with a female perspective and an insight into a female insight into the world of the Eastern Jewish Ashkenazi shtetl, a female perspective that was very unusual for the time of its origin in the early 20th century. What kind of world did the author Esther Kreitman Singer and her protagonist Deborah live in? The role of women was very firmly and narrowly defined in the firmly traditional religious culture of Eastern European Jews, even more so than in the Christian or increasingly secular surrounding culture. According to the Jewish tradition of that time, women did not need to be educated, or even worse, they should not be educated. They should become good wives and good mothers as early as possible, and so limit themselves to acquiring the necessary skills and abilities for these roles. And of course, they were always bound to submit to the dictates of their father or later their husbands in all decisions, even the most personal ones. And if there were any ambiguities, questions, doubts, or heaven forbid, even disagreements among husband and wife, then the ultimate authority was, of course, the Talmud, or rather its unquestionable interpretation by the local rabbi, who was the supreme authority, and of course, a male authority, the supreme male authority in the shtetl. And it was in such a context that also the author, Esther Kreitman Singer, grew up. She was born under the name of Hinde Esther Sarah Singer in 1891 in Bilgoraj, which is a small town or village near Lublin in southeastern rural Poland. She was born into traditional rabbinical Jewish family, but not just any family, but the Singer family, which would soon become known in the literary world, but not because of her, not because of Esther, but because of her two younger brothers. Isaac Bashevis Singer, who in 1978 was the first and only Yiddish language writer so far to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature, and Israel Joshua Singer, who was at least as talented as his younger brother. I have already presented one of his novels, the Karnowski family, in this video, but who was denied a greater fame and success, I think, because he died in exile in New York in 1944 at the relatively young age of 51. One might think that in such a literary family with such sophisticated, educated, and cosmopolitan brothers, a sister who was hungry for education and also had a literary talent and literary ambitions, that in such a family, this sister should have had more freedom and thus more better conditions for developing her personality and her talents. But far from it. However empathetic and open-minded the brothers present themselves in their own literary works. Towards their own sister, they were almost outrageously conservative, disparaging, and restrictive. Throughout her whole life, Esther's literary ambitions were not only not taken seriously by her family, they were outright rejected. She was expected to fulfill the traditional role model, and her literary ambitions were considered utterly improper. So she was pushed into an arranged marriage, and she was considered by her parents and her brothers to be the black sheep of the family because she did not want to accept this role and she was not happy with it. And the rejection began very early, in her earliest childhood days. Her mother was so disappointed by the birth of her daughter Esther. She would have preferred to have a son as her firstborn. That would have given her a higher status in the community. So she was so disappointed by this birth of a daughter that she left little Esther in the care of a wet nurse for the first 3 years of her life. The wet nurse lived in the poorest of circumstances, and Esther was only visited by her mother once a week. And during these weekly visits, the mother did not even touch her. So this is at least how Esther's son Maurice Carr, who later worked also as a journalist and a writer, how Maurice Carr told the story, because he has also written a touching biography of his mother. Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Nobel Prize winning brother, outwardly dedicated one of his late short story volumes, published, I think, in 1968. He dedicated it to the memory of his sister, who was already deceased at that time. But 20 years earlier, when she actively sought his help, while she was still alive in 1947, and he was already living in quite secure circumstances in the US, he absolutely ignored her. He did not even answer her letters, and he did not send her any money she was asking for to enable her immigration to the US. And Esther's books were never reviewed in the Yiddish newspaper forwards that was published in the US, and for which both Singer brothers were working as journalists and as literary critics. So now she is said to have been a somewhat difficult character. Probably she was suffering from epilepsy and also of a very quick-tempered character. Who can live with a volcano? Her brother Isaac once wrote about her. But to ignore her in this way and to refuse to support her, this, I think, casts quite a long shadow over the two Singer brothers, whom I otherwise hold in high esteem for their literary works. Just a few more facts about the further life of Esther before I talk about her novel. Her arranged marriage to Abraham Kreitman, a diamond cutter from Antwerp, was an unhappy one. They were not a good match, and they had to work very hard to make ends meet, and had to work in low jobs. And Esther earned a small extra money, small extra income by translating English literary classics into the Yiddish language, but she didn't gain much by it. And when the First World War broke out, they emigrated to London, where Esther then lived until her death in 1954. She wrote only two novels, Der Scheidimtanz, published in English under the title Deborah, and Brillanten, which is also available at least in Italian and in English translations. In addition, there is a volume of short stories and Yiddish, translated into English as Blitz and Other Stories. But today we will only talk about, sorry, her first, her first novel, Deborah. I got to know this novel and thus also Esther Kreitman, not directly in the Yiddish original, but through the Italian translation with the title La danza dei demoni, which means dance of the demons, and which is a fairly literal translation of the original Yiddish title. So, what is this novel, Dance of the Demons, or Deborah? What is it about? The novel tells a story with strong autobiographical elements. It's about a young Jewish woman called Deborah, who is born into a poor family of rabbis in rural eastern Poland. Deborah is extremely bright, intelligent, hungry for knowledge, and she secretly reads, and she secretly learns Russian, and she suffers from the fact that as a talented girl or woman, she is forbidden from doing all the things she's interested in and, sh- and she yearns for. Whereas on the other side, her lazy little brother is granted all these privileges, reading, learning, studying. He even has to be forced to do all this because he is not inclined to do this. He is quite lazy and he's more interested in strolling around with his friends in the village. So Deborah's frustration of being constantly belittled and disrespected takes its toll. Her intelligent questions are mostly ignored by her father, and in the few cases where an answer is given, the answer is often deeply hurtful or even despiteful. A small example, taken just from the second page of the novel, illustrates Deborah's frustrating situation. When the subject in the family conversation is once again what a great future as a rabbi and Talmud scholar is open to the little brother Michael, Deborah asks her father what she could become or would become. And the answer, I now freely translate from the Italian version, is what should become of you one day? Well, nothing, of course. That's obvious. Uh, and it's clear that a young woman of Deborah's intellectual caliber cannot be satisfied with this and it cannot accept it. And so she has no choice but to secretly devote herself to reading learned books and hoping for the yearning for the few days when the traveling bookseller visits her little village and she can get intellectual supplies. And this is how she comes also into contact with, heaven forbid, the critical writings of the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, who is considered the intellectual or spiritual father of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement. And of course, she can only read such books in the greatest secrecy. But ultimately, her sphere of influence, of self-liberation is really limited, and she is constrained to fulfilling her domestic duties as a daughter and, yeah, to the shallow, superficial, narrow-minded gossip and chatter in the marketplace, which she finds really unbearable. And through Deborah's keen eye and observations, the reader step by step gains a detailed insight into the rules of Jewish life in this outwardly very rule-abiding small rural community. And over time, the reader also notices that, in fact, this outwardly very pious society, but also in her family, there are just as many hypocrisies, character weaknesses, vanities, and human conflicts boiling beneath the surface. The father is essentially a failure. In order to work as an official rabbi with a secure income, he would have had to pass the mandatory rabbi exam prescribed by the state authorities. This was mandatory because rabbis also performed sort of official acts such as marriages, funerals, etc. And to do so, to pass this exam, you would have had to learn Russian and to demonstrate at least a basic knowledge of, let's call it, secular general education. However, as an extremely pious person and fixated on Talmud study only, as he was, so he dropped out of this part of the rabbi training. And now he's an extremely knowledgeable Talmud scholar, but he's completely clueless and helpless in all other worldly and practical matters. So for his wife, Reitzele, who is the daughter of a real and more sophisticated rabbi, he's a disappointment and a failure. Reisele married Deborah's father at the age of 15 or 16 when he was still considered an aspiring and promising future rabbi. But now, as he doesn't have this official exam, he can only work as an unofficial rabbi in small, poor Jewish villages. And he can just only about keep his family slightly above the poverty line with the little money that he earns. Often they have to change house, they have to change the village they're living in. The family has to move because the income at the current place of residence is not enough to make ends meet. But then there's a Jewish community of another place that at least offers the prospect of a slightly higher pittance. And yeah, the naive father's grandiose plans to get a well-paid job in the Talmud school of a tzaddik turn out to be pipe dreams only. Just a short explanation: a tzaddik was a honorary title in Judaism for particularly pious and respected Jewish scholars who enjoyed a kind of a saintly status even during their lifetime. So the common people often believed even that the tzaddik could perform miracles such as healing illnesses or averting misfortune and preventing you from bad luck and so on. And Esther Kreitman thoroughly dispels this myth of the tzaddik. The tzaddik for whom Deborah's father works turns out to be a sanctimonious miser who is good for nothing but outwardly pious and honorable behavior, but whose promises of payment all turn out to be empty talk or even blatant lies. Ultimately, under the guise of his position as a particularly holy, respected, and venerable person, this tzaddik only exploits his fellow human beings and thus also Deborah's father. As the family moves from town to town and finally even to the city of Warsaw, Deborah also comes into secret contact with other young people who rebel against the prevailing societal constraints, who dream of a socialist revolution or even work for it in the underground. And this society she gets in contact with also includes a young Jew named Simon, who Esther finds very interesting and attractive. So they secretly fall in love with each other, but for various reasons, which I'm not going to explain in detail in order not to spoil the plot, it doesn't work out. So ultimately, Esther cannot prevent her family from arranging a marriage for her with a young Jew from Antwerp. And so she has to marry this young Jew and move to Antwerp. And whether Deborah's hopes of a more cosmopolitan, more free life are fulfilled by moving to the city of Antwerp, I will not tell you, but I invite you to find out for yourself by reading this nice book. Deborah by Esther Kreitman Singer. I think it's a fascinating example of female literature in Yiddish language, which is unusual for the time, and a novel with an extremely feminine and enlightened view of Eastern Jewish society and life at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. That's it for today. Thank you for watching this video. I hope I've been able to raise your interest in this novel. Have a great reading time. Hope to see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye and ciao.